The thing about Harrow Creek was that it never looked dangerous until you'd already stayed too long. It sat low in a valley between two dry ridges, the kind of town that had been almost abandoned so many times that the people who remained had stopped expecting things to get better. The main street was wide and quiet. The storefronts were faded. And when a stranger rode in at dusk on a gray horse with no markings, the few men still sitting outside the saloon found somewhere else to look. Samson Cerny had that effect on people. He wasn't large in the way that made men step aside out of admiration. He was lean, unhurried, with a face that gave away nothing, not cruelty, not warmth, not even fatigue, though he'd been riding for 3 days. He tied his horse at the post outside the only hotel still operating in Harrow Creek and went inside without asking if there was a room. There was. There always was in towns like this. He had one job. A woman named Viola Herrell owned 43 acres at the eastern edge of town where the creek bent, and the soil was darker than anywhere else in the valley. She had been refusing to sell for 14 months. 3 men had gone out to change her mind. 2 came back empty-handed. 1 didn't come back at all, though the official story was that he'd simply moved on. The Weston syndicate had stopped being patient. Samson had met with their man in a back room in Abilene, a soft-spoken fellow in a clean suit who slid an envelope across the table and said only, "We don't need her moved. We need the problem resolved." Samson had taken the envelope without asking what was in it. He already knew. He'd done this kind of work before, though he'd never quite found a word for it that sat comfortably in his chest. He told himself it didn't need a word. It was just work. The morning after he arrived, he rode out to the Herrell property before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. He wasn't going to do anything, not yet. He wanted to see the land. He wanted to see her. What he found was not what he'd been told to expect. The ranch house was modest but well kept. Sitting at the end of a dirt track lined with young cedar trees that someone had planted with deliberate care. The fences were repaired in some places and broken in others, telling the story of a woman doing the work of 2 people with the energy of 1. A vegetable garden ran along the south side of the house, small but serious. A gray cat watched him from the porch railing, with the calm authority of something that owned the place. Viola Herrell was behind the barn when he found her, working a length of wire through a fence post with bare hands. She didn't startle when she heard his horse. She just looked up, assessed him the way a person assesses weather, and went back to the wire. "You're lost," she said. It wasn't a question. "Looking for work," Samson said. "Heard there might be a ranch around here needing hands." She pulled the wire through, wrapped the end twice, and straightened up. She was somewhere in her mid-30s with the kind of face that had been pretty once and was now something better. Defined, certain, tired in a way that hadn't broken her. There was a smear of grease on her left forearm, and she didn't seem to notice or care. "Who told you that?" she asked. "Man in town," he said. Samson gave a name he'd made up on the ride over. She studied him for a long moment. The cat had followed him from the porch and was now sitting near his horse's front hooves, still watching. "I don't need hands," she said finally. "I need someone who can work without being told twice and who doesn't ask too many questions." She paused. "Those are 2 different things." "I understand the difference," he said. She looked at him for another few seconds. Then she said, 50 cents a day, you sleep in the barn. You eat what I cook and you don't complain about it. You leave when I tell you to leave." She picked up her tools. "You can start on that east fence. It's been down since February." He dismounted without another word. He told himself it was strategy. Get close, learn the layout, find the right moment, the right window, the kind of quiet opportunity that left no mess and raised no alarm. It was the same as any other job. You moved slowly, you stayed patient, and you didn't let the surroundings get inside you. But that evening, when she set a plate of beans and cornbread on the porch railing without calling him and walked back inside before he could thank her, something shifted. Not much, just a degree or 2. The way a compass needle moves when it gets close to something it wasn't expecting. He sat on the step and ate alone in the cooling dark, listening to the creek run somewhere behind the tree line, and he thought about the man in the clean suit and the envelope and the words, "Problem resolved." Then he looked at the cedar trees she'd planted along the drive, straight and deliberate, and he thought about how long it takes a cedar to grow tall enough to give shade. Someone had planted those trees, believing they'd still be here to see it. He set his plate down. He didn't sleep well that night. 3 weeks passed before Samson admitted to himself that he had a problem. It hadn't happened all at once. That was the trouble with it. If it had been sudden, if he'd woken up one morning and simply decided he couldn't do the job, he might have been able to reason his way back. But it came in small pieces, the way rot comes to wood. Quiet, gradual. By the time you noticed, it had already gone deep. The east fence took 4 days. Then she pointed him toward the roof of the barn where 3 planks had warped and lifted over the winter and let the rain in. After that, it was the water pump, then the broken axle on her hauling wagon, then the stretch of creek bank that flooded every time there was hard rain and needed to be shored up with stone. There was always something. The ranch ran on the edge of collapse, the way a coin spins on a table, constantly almost falling, never quite. Viola Herrell managed it the way she managed everything, without complaint, without asking for pity, without ever seeming to need someone to tell her she was doing well. That was the part that got under his skin first. He'd worked for difficult men and easy men and frightened men, and he'd learned to read people quickly because his life had sometimes depended on it. He knew greed when he saw it. He knew desperation. He knew the particular way a person held their shoulders when they were hiding something that was eating them alive. Viola wasn't hiding anything like that. What she was hiding was quieter. She moved through certain parts of the ranch, the northwest corner of the property near the old dry well, with a deliberate avoidance that wasn't careless. She never went there, never directed him there either, though the fencing in that area was some of the worst on the land. When he mentioned it once casually, she said the ground was soft and unstable and not worth the trouble. He let it go, but he noted it. The other thing he noted was the boy. He appeared on a Thursday afternoon, riding a small roan pony up the drive with the confidence of someone who'd made the trip many times. He was perhaps 9 years old, with Viola's same dark eyes and a seriousness about his face that children that age didn't usually carry. She came off the porch before the boy had even dismounted and pulled him into a brief, tight embrace that she ended quickly, as though she'd remembered herself. Samson was repairing the porch step when it happened. He didn't look up. Later that evening, after the boy had gone back to wherever he came from, Viola came and stood near where Samson was cleaning his tools and said without preamble, "My son, he stays with my sister in town during the week. Safer that way." Samson waited. "Men have come to the property before," she said. "Not drifters. Men with purposes." She looked at him directly when she said it, and he met her eyes and held them because flinching would have told her something true. "I keep him away until I know a situation is settled." "That's sensible," Samson said. She studied him a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she went inside. He sat with that for a long time after dark. She knew the shape of her danger. She'd seen men with purposes before, and she'd learned to read the edges of a situation without being told what was at the center of it. She wasn't naive. She wasn't helpless. She was a woman who had built a life on difficult ground and planted cedar trees along the drive because she intended to stay long enough to see them grow. And she was doing it while also protecting a child and managing a ranch and holding off forces she probably only half understood. The man in the clean suit had called her a problem. Samson put his tools away and didn't think about the envelope. It was near the end of the 3rd week that the first rider came. Samson saw him from the roof of the barn, where he was replacing a final warped plank. The rider came from the west road, stopped at the edge of the property, sat there for a long minute looking at the house, and then turned and rode back the way he'd come, without approaching. Samson climbed down and said nothing to Viola. But that night, he moved his bedroll from the center of the barn to the corner, nearest the door, where he could see the drive. And he checked his rifle in the dark with the quiet mechanical habit of a man who had learned not to wait until morning. 2 days later, a different rider came. This one stopped at the gate, looked at the house, looked at the barn, looked, Samson was certain, directly at him, and left. They were checking, making sure he was still there, making sure the job was still in motion. He was running out of time. What he did not expect was what happened the following Sunday. Viola had ridden into Harrow Creek for supplies. A trip she made every 2 weeks with a precision that suggested routine was a form of armor for her. She'd been gone 3 hours when Samson walked around to the northwest corner of the property, the place she avoided, and began pulling back the overgrown brush near the old dry well. It took him 20 minutes to find it. Not gold, not a body, not anything violent. A wooden box sealed with oilcloth and buried shallow beneath a flat stone. Inside it, a deed, land documents, and beneath those, a letter in handwriting he didn't recognize, addressed to Viola, dated 4 years earlier, signed with a name that stopped him cold. The name belonged to a man Samson knew, not personally, by reputation, by the kind of reputation that traveled ahead of a person through certain dark rooms in certain dark towns. A man who had worked at one time for the Weston Syndicate. Viola's late husband. Samson stood there in the brush with the letter in his hand and the dry well at his feet and understood for the first time that this was never only about land. He put everything back exactly as he'd found it, replaced the stone, straightened the brush. When Viola returned from town, he was on the porch whittling the same as any other afternoon. She looked at him when she climbed down from the wagon, not with suspicion exactly, with something more careful than that. "You eat yet?" she asked. "No," he said. "Then come inside," she said, and went through the door. He folded his knife, looked out at the cedar trees along the drive, taller than they'd seemed when he first arrived. Or maybe he was just paying closer attention now. Then he followed her in. It was 3 nights later, after a supper that had gone quiet, in a way that felt different from other quiet suppers, heavier, like air before a storm, that Samson set down his coffee cup and said without looking at her directly, "I think you should consider letting someone have legal standing on this property, someone who could defend it if it came to that." Viola didn't answer right away. She turned her cup slowly on the table. "What kind of legal standing?" she said. Not a question, she already understood what kind. "The kind that's harder to fight than a widow alone," he said. The silence stretched. The fire in the stove ticked. "You've been here less than a month," she said finally. "I know," he said. Another long pause. He still wasn't looking at her. She was still turning the cup. "I'll think about it," she said. It was not a yes, but it was not a no. And in the space between those two things, something shifted in the room. Something neither of them named, because naming it would have made it real. In a way that both of them, for entirely different reasons, were not yet ready for. Outside, somewhere on the western ridge, a rider had been sitting still in the dark for the better part of an hour. Samson knew because he'd seen him before he came inside. The Weston Syndicate was not going to wait much longer. She said yes on a Wednesday, not with warmth, not with anything that resembled the way people usually said yes to things that mattered. She came to the barn at first light while Samson was saddling his horse, stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, and the early morning gray behind her, and said, "I've thought about it. We do it legal and quiet. No announcement, no celebration, and it changes nothing about how this property is run." Samson nodded, understood. "I mean that," she said. "I know you do," he said. They rode into Harrow Creek that same morning and found the justice of the peace still eating his breakfast. He married them in his front room with eggs still on his fork and 2 witnesses pulled in from the street who didn't know either of them and didn't ask questions. Viola signed the document with the same hand she used to run fence wire, steady, deliberate, no hesitation. Samson signed beside her name. They rode back to the ranch in silence. That evening was the same as any other evening. She cooked. He fixed a loose cabinet hinge that had been bothering him for a week. They ate without much conversation. When she went inside and closed her bedroom door, he went to the barn and lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about the letter in the box beneath the dry well, and the name signed at the bottom of it, and how many more days he had before the men on the ridge stopped watching and started moving. Not many. He could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. He had made a decision somewhere in the past 3 weeks, though he couldn't point to the exact moment it had happened. Decisions like that never had a single moment. They accumulated the way the cedar trees accumulated height, slowly, quietly, until one day you looked and they were simply taller than before. He was not going to finish the job. What he was going to do instead was considerably more dangerous. They came on a Friday 4 days after the wedding. Samson was at the creek bank when he heard the horses, not one or two but several, moving without urgency up the main drive, the way men move when they don't expect resistance. He came around the side of the barn at a pace that looked unhurried and was not. There were 5 of them. He recognized the man at the front, not from personal acquaintance, but from the particular way he sat a horse, like someone who had spent a long time being obeyed. His name was Pruitt. He worked acquisitions for the Weston Syndicate, which was a clean word for a dirty function. Pruitt looked at Samson with an expression that was almost friendly. "Cerny," he said, "you've taken your time." "Job needed doing carefully," Samson said. "Job needed doing a month ago," Pruitt replied. He looked past him toward the house. "We're here to close it out. You've done your part." Samson said nothing. Pruitt's eyes came back to him. Something in them sharpened. "You've done your part," he repeated, slower this time. The front door of the house opened. Viola stepped onto the porch. She had likely heard the horses from inside. She stood with her hands at her sides and looked at the 5 men in her drive, and then at Samson, and in the half-second before her expression settled into stillness, he saw it. The recognition, not of Pruitt, not of the Weston Syndicate by name, but of the shape of the moment, the geometry of it. 5 armed men, one familiar face among them. A month of small questions she had never quite asked, suddenly arranged into an answer she hadn't wanted. Her eyes moved to Samson. He didn't look away. "Mrs. Cerny," Pruitt said pleasantly, because he was the kind of man who was pleasant about everything. "We have business regarding this property." "This property," Viola said, "belongs to me and my husband. Legally, as of 4 days ago." Her voice was even, extraordinarily even. "Whatever business you think you have here, you can take it to a court." Pruitt smiled. "Courts take time. We're not interested in time." He nodded to the men behind him. 2 of them dismounted. What happened next was not slow. Samson moved before the first man's boots hit the ground, putting himself between the dismounting riders and the porch. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was simply a body occupying space the way a door occupies a frame. Pruitt looked at him with something that was no longer even pretending to be friendliness. "You're making a significant mistake," Pruitt said. "I've made them before," Samson said. From the corner of his eye he could see Viola had gone back through the front door. He didn't know if she was running or retrieving something, and for 3 seconds that uncertainty sat in his chest like a stone. Then she came back through the door with a rifle. She came to the edge of the porch and she raised it, and she aimed it, not at Samson. The 2 dismounted men stopped moving. Pruitt tilted his head with mild interest. The morning was very quiet, except for the horses shifting their weight and the distant sound of the creek. Samson stood completely still. She held the aim for a long moment, long enough that he could see her breathing, could see the calculation moving behind her eyes like weather across open ground. She knew. She had put it together, the arrival without reference. The questions about the northwest corner, the proposal that came from strategy before it came from anything else. She had assembled every piece, and she knew exactly what he had ridden into Harrow Creek to do. The rifle didn't waver, then she turned it, smooth, unhurried, the way she did everything. She shifted her aim to Pruitt and in the same motion said to Samson without looking at him, "There are 2 on your left." He was already moving. What followed was brief and loud and settled faster than such things usually did. Because Pruitt's men had arrived expecting a widow and a turned coat. Not a widow who could shoot, and a man who had quietly decided which side of a door he was standing on. 1 man ran. 2 went down with wounds that would heal if treated properly. Pruitt himself caught a rifle stock across the jaw from Viola at close range when he tried to take her from behind. A moment she handled with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting a long time to stop being patient. When the dust cleared and the sound stopped echoing off the ridges, there were 2 men on the ground, one disappearing over the west ridge. and Poot sitting against the fence post holding his jaw and looking at nothing in particular. Samson stood in the middle of the drive. Viola stood on the edge of the porch. There were perhaps 15 feet between them. Neither closed the distance. She still had the rifle. She wasn't aiming it at anyone anymore, just holding it at her side. There was a cut above her eyebrow from something in the chaos. She didn't seem to notice it. She looked at him the way she had looked at him that very first morning, by the fence post, like weather, like something she was deciding how to move around. He didn't offer an explanation. There was no version of one that would land cleanly, and they both knew it. "The box under the dry well," he said instead. "Your husband's letter. The Weston Syndicate wasn't after this land because of the land." He paused. "Your husband knew something about them, something he wrote down. They needed it buried." She was quiet for a moment. "How long have you known?" 3 weeks. Another silence, a longer one. "And the job they sent you to do," she said. "I know what the job was," he said. "So do I," she said. "I've known for about 10 days. That landed. He hadn't expected it. He should have." She was exactly the kind of person who would know and say nothing until she'd decided what to do with the knowing. She had looked at him across supper tables for 10 days, and said nothing and made no move, and simply waited to see what shape the moment would take when it finally arrived. "You let me stay," he said. "I needed to see what you'd do," she said. Somewhere behind the tree line, the creek was running the same as always. Pewitt made a sound against the fence post that no one paid attention to. The gray cat appeared from around the corner of the barn and sat down in the middle of the drive between them, as though it had been watching the whole time and found the resolution adequate. Viola looked at the cat, then back at Samson. "The boy comes home tomorrow," she said. "I'd like the drive clear before then." "I'll handle it," he said. She nodded once, turned toward the door, stopped with her hand on the frame, and stood there a moment without turning around. "The cabinet hinge you fixed last week," she said. "It's the first thing in this house that hasn't needed fixing twice." She went inside. The door didn't close all the way behind her. Samson stood in the drive in the settling dust with the morning coming full over the ridge and the cedar trees catching the first clean light along their tops. And he understood that what had just been left open was not an accident. It was not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not for a long time, but it was a door, and he was still on the property. 6 months later, Viola's son learned that the man who fixed things around the ranch and ate supper at their table every evening and sometimes read aloud from the worn Bible on the shelf had a first name he was allowed to use. A year after that, on a cold morning in November with frost on the cedar branches and the boy asleep inside, Samson found Viola at the fence line where they had first spoken and stood beside her without a word, and she did not move away. They stood together watching the ridge go gold with the coming sun, close enough that their shoulders touched, and neither of them remarked on it. Because some things, once they arrive, don't need remarking on. The cedar trees had grown tall enough by then to give shade.